If you want to get into blacksmithing, you don't have to assume that everything's expensive. There are a multitude of necessary tools that you can make yourself. In fact, the blacksmith is the only craftsman who can make his own tools, you know, more or less. And so I started into this craft in 2005, and right away I began to see additional tooling that I needed, and then had to sort of discipline myself to find the time to either buy it or build it in order to move forward in the craft. I want to show you 5 tools that were not expensive. Let me repeat that. They were not expensive, and the ones that I made didn't take me long to make, but they made a big difference in sort of a fundamental way in the satisfaction and the convenience and the quality that I was getting out of the things that I was making. I think one of the reasons that blacksmithing is so compelling and is growing so rapidly is because it's fundamental and it's kind of simple on the face of it, but there's an infinite number of ways to think about doing things faster or better or more elegantly. And when you do, when you discover those ways and those tools, it sort of brings more joy to what you're doing, and the fascination can grow. So these are 5 simple, in some cases well-known, in some cases not so well-known tools that have come to me over the last 10 years that I wish would have come a little sooner. I'm going to start with the most recent adaptation, and it's this Swivel Bolster, I call it. I think Brian Brazil came up with this. I'm not positive. I saw it on a video somewhere and I thought it's brilliant, and so I made one, and we have a video that includes sort of a demonstration of this. But the idea of using a bolster to control the work you're doing to a rivet or a bolt head or any number of other things in blacksmithing is important, and this is the best way I've come up with so far to make it happen. These are monkey tools. I have no idea why these are called monkey tools, but what these are used for in a lot of cases, there's a lot of things you can use these things for. I mean, all these tools are interchangeable, is to upset or smooth out or make a nice flat shoulder at the back end of a tenon. Blacksmithing makes mortises and tenons just like woodworking, and the monkey tool slips over the tenon to flatten out the shoulder of the work that slips up against the mortise. Ken Jordan made these, I think I mentioned that, but you can make your own easily enough if you have shaft material or any number of other shapes and a drill press ideally, or know somebody that has one. Ken did these on his lathe. This is a guillotine tool. Kenny made me this too. We went to a blacksmith conference up in Washington, and somebody had these for sale, and Ken said, well, you know, I could make those. I said, would you make me one? He said, of course. Now this is a little more sophisticated than this spring fuller, which does about the same thing. And what this does is you drop either one of these into the hardy hole on your anvil, you put the hot work in there, and you hit it with a hammer, and it puts the same indentation on both sides of the work. This one I can make different bits and put in there, different dies. This would make an indentation on the top and the bottom. You can put shearing tools and lining tools. There's a lot of things you can do with a guillotine tool. And there is a tool that is easily made called a blacksmith's helper. And if you've got an arc welder or know somebody that does, you can make a dandy version of this. Not much money, not much time, big, big move forward in your blacksmithing. The last 2 are the most elemental. I forged for, 10 years maybe with this rounding hammer. It's a 4-pounder. And, you know, it's a kind of a gradual radius and a flat face, and you know, you try to keep track of those when you're working, when you need a flat face, when you need a rounding face. And then this little guy, this little mechanic's hammer, showed up in my shop, and I thought, it's a 2-pounder. And I thought, well, I don't need 2 flat faces any more than you need that on your single jack when you're setting forms. So I just put it on the grinder and rounded that over a pretty profound radius. This has become maybe the most versatile of the little hammers in my shop. I love it. So if you're just starting into the craft, find a little junk mechanic's hammer. It doesn't have to be nice. Round one side over, just a 2-pounder, and you're going to be amazed at the number of rivets that you can set, and number of chamfers you can clean up, and number of things that you can do with a 2-pound rounding hammer, combination hammer, that will become your go-to tool in a lot of cases. Now this last item, this is a roll of lead wire. And I don't even remember how it showed up in the shop, but it's old. And it's lead, so you don't want to put a pinch between your cheek and gum. But one particular day I had laid out a scroll for something. I don't know if it was a corbel or what it was. And I was going to bend a piece of copper wire to get the length of the compound curves. I thought, wait a minute, I've got some lead wire. Look how nice this is for finding the length of complicated shapes. You know, you can just mold that right around any shape that you want, that you've drawn out on your layout table or on a chalkboard. And before you know it, you can straighten it out just as easy as that and find out how much material you need to cut off before you commit yourself to bending, you know, to laying it into the jig or whatever you got to do. You can get an accurate length with a minimum of muss and fuss. Better than a string line, better than a copper wire, better than almost anything else I've found. And so I don't know if it's worth buying a roll of lead wire, but if you can get your hands on some, you won't be sorry. And what all of this does is introduces the beauty and the elegance that's connected with the craft of blacksmithing, where you can make your own gear. I mean, who else can do that? And there's a story that's been around for a long, long time. And there are various versions, and I'm going to give you my version. This is probably a rough adaptation of the one that I heard from Mark Asbury. 15 years ago, I took a joinery class from Mark Asbury. He's terrific. Check out his YouTube videos. But it's a story of St. Christopher, the patron saint of blacksmiths. And it's the story of a king. In some of the iterations, it's King Arthur. I don't know what the king's name was, but his kingdom was prosperous and it was happy. And he was expanding his influence, and he had just finished a new castle. And to sort of commemorate the accomplishment of building this beautiful edifice and sort of monument to his importance, he put together a banquet for all of the craftsmen who had contributed to his beautiful, beautiful, beautiful castle and the palace and the dining room. And the table was set with the finest flatware, and the guests were seated, and they were all there. And there was an empty place to the king's right hand, beautifully set, beautifully appointed, right next to him. And so after the dinner, you know, he got everybody's attention. And a king has no problem getting people's attention. And so all of these guys who were blue-collar, tradesmen, craftsmen, calloused hands, for the most part, had their attention riveted on the king, because it had been announced that he was going to sort of crown the king of the craftsmen. He was going to identify who was the most important craftsman in his kingdom. And so the king began to ask these fellows assembled what they had done, what their craft was, and you know, just kind of get acquainted. And he started with the carpenter. Mr. Carpenter, yes, your majesty. You've done a lot of work on this castle, haven't you? Well, yes, I have. Well, what have you done in this space, for instance? And he says, well, your majesty, this very table and these very chairs were crafted in my workshop. The moldings and the doors and the benches and all of the woodwork that you can see in this room and in every other room in the castle came out of my shop. That's wonderful, Master Carpenter. I thank you so much for your contribution. You use a lot of tools in your work, don't you? Yes, I do, your majesty, many tools. Well, who makes those tools? Well, the blacksmith makes the tools. Oh, okay, well, thank you so much for the woodwork. And then I think he probably went to the stonemason. Mr. Stonemason, yes, your majesty. What have you done in this space and in my castle? Well, your majesty, I did hew and square and lay out and make perfection out of all of the granite that has been stacked up to make the castle. I made the strong walls. I even carved the gargoyles and it is all the stonework has come from my hands and the hands of the men who serve me. It's hard work, your majesty. Oh, well, you've done such a fine job, and we feel safe and secure behind your stone walls. And you use a lot of tools. Oh, you have quite a few tools, your majesty. Well, who makes your tools? Well, the blacksmith makes my tools, your majesty. Oh, thank you so much. And then as he continued, he got to the tailor, the weaver, the tailor. Sir Tailor, yes, your majesty. What have you done in our space? Well, the tapestries and the curtains and the tablecloth and the embroidery. And your majesty, I even made the very robes that you're wearing tonight. Well, I sure love them. They're sure nice. And who makes your tools, Mr. Tailor? Well, the blacksmith makes my needles and my scissors. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Sir Blacksmith, yes, your majesty. He was sitting at the end. He was dirty. He was black. His hair was uncombed, and his fingernails and his face were black and sooty. And the king said, "Sir Blacksmith, what have you done in my castle?" "Well," he said, "the nails and the hinges and the buckles on your belts and the bits in the horse's mouth and all the pots and the pans in the kitchen and all of," yeah, he said, I've done some stuff around here." "Oh, yeah, well, who makes your tools?" "Well, I do, Your Majesty." "Mr. Blacksmith, would you please come up here and be seated at my right hand? I name you the king of the craftsmen." And so the blacksmith slouched his way up and sat down there, and then they started dessert. And the tailor hated it. He hated it. And so while no one was watching, he slid under the table like a weasel or a marten. And that's from the Christmas poem, The Boy Who Laughed at Santa Claus, by the way. Highly recommended. And he slunk up under the wide table, not touching anyone's knee, and he got up to where the blacksmith sat, who was, by the way, still wearing his soiled and shiny leather apron, and he had his scissors, and he lifted up the corner of the blacksmith's apron, and he cut some fringe in the bottom as a token of his disregard and disdain for such a simple and unsophisticated man. And then he went back to his seat, and he climbed up from underneath the tablecloth, and no one knew the difference. And that is why, to this day, in many blacksmith shops, you will see that the blacksmith has 2 or 3 little slices in the bottom of his apron to commemorate the tailor's angst and the blacksmith's victory. Thank you for watching Essential Craftsman. Keep up the good work.